PS4 joysticks are prone to having drift. If you've tried cleaning the inside and that hasn't fixed the drift, then you'll need to replace the joysticks. This involves taking the controller apart, desoldering and then resoldering new joysticks. Follow along with this guide on how to do that, and if you're unsure what tools or parts you need to complete this repair, follow the link in the description below where you can purchase the exact parts and tools we're using throughout this guide. So to start this repair, you're going to need to use a Phillips screwdriver to remove the 4 screws at the back holding the controller together. Next, using tweezers or a prying tool, pry the L1 and R1 buttons from the housing. Now you can pry open the housing. This is a bit fiddly. It's held together by 6 clips, 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom and 2 on each side. Start by prying open the clips on the side and then the 2 at the bottom. Once you've got those free, you'll need to stick a prying tool in the top of the controller to release the clips at the top. Before fully opening the controller, you'll need to disengage the L2 and R2 clips so as not to damage them in the process. Once opened, you can disconnect the interconnect cable from its socket to release the rear cover. To remove the battery, disconnect the battery cable from the motherboard. Try and pull at the head of the cable when doing this. Next, you can remove the battery bracket by lifting it out of the 2 clips holding it down. Now you can disconnect the touchpad cable by pulling it out of its socket. Then you can unscrew the screw in the center of the motherboard with a Phillips screwdriver. Next, we need to desolder the vibration motor cables on both sides. Do this by applying flux to the bottom of the cables and use a solder iron to desolder the cables. You'll need to make a note or take a picture of how the cables are organised before desoldering them so you can refer to it when resoldering. Notice how on the left side the positive cable is above the negative, and on the right side it's the opposite, with the negative cable at the top and the positive at the bottom. You can now gently remove the motherboard from the controller by pressing the spring clips in. You can now remove the analog caps. Next, you're going to need to desolder all of the joystick connections. Start by applying solder flux to the solder connections and using a soldering iron and low melt solder, start melting the soldering joints. The low melt solder will bring down the melting point, making it easier to melt the joints. Next, press your soldering iron against a bit of solder wick and start melting the remainder of the joints. Make sure to apply more flux if needed. We're using a helping hands tool to hold the board in place for this. To finish off, use a hot air gun to help melt the joints and use the solder iron tip to push against the joints until the joystick falls out. Clear up any excess solder with your solder wick to make sure all of the holes are clear. You won't be able to fit the new joystick unless the hole is clear of solder. Remove any excess flux with IPA and a cleaning cloth. Once the holes are clear, you can fit the new joysticks to the board. We're replacing the joysticks with Hall sensor joysticks, which don't rely on physical contact to measure movement. Instead, they use magnetic fields, which means there's no wear and tear on internal parts, which is what causes drift in traditional joysticks. Also, because there's no mechanical contact, they're far more durable, precise and responsive. Next, you'll need to resolder the joysticks, apply flux to the joints, and then using a soldering iron and solder, feed solder to each joint. Once finished, wipe them clean to remove any excess. We're using 138° solder wire for this. Now you can put the analog caps back on and put the motherboard back into its housing. Using a soldering iron, resolder the vibration motor cables to their solder joints. Put the motherboard into the console front housing and using a Phillips screwdriver, screw the motherboard back down and reconnect the touchpad cables. Reconnect the battery bracket and then reconnect the battery cable to the motherboard. Next, reconnect the interconnect cable into its motherboard socket, making sure the blue pull tab is facing the outside of the controller. Press the front and rear housing together and refit the L1 and R1 buttons. Lastly, using a Phillips screwdriver, screw the 4 Phillips screws into the rear of the console. Before using your controller, you'll need to calibrate your joysticks by connecting your controller to your computer and following the link in the description to the online calibration tool. I hope you found this guide useful. If you did, give this video a thumbs up and click the subscribe button if you want to see more repair content like this one.